Hey everyone, Dad and I just got back from a pretty epic float hunt in Alaska for caribou. We flew into the headwaters of a river and dragged our boats down to some floatable water. I took a bow, Dad packed a rifle, and we spent a total of 15 days out in the bush floating and hunting for caribou. It's been about 10 years since our only other caribou hunt, which was awesome, and we're hoping this one lives up to our memories from that hunt. Everything about an Alaskan float hunt is a lot of work, starting with getting your rafts and gear and weapons through the airport. Like most Alaskan wilderness hunts, this one begins on a bush plane. This is a helio courier, and we were allowed to bring 750 pounds, including ourselves and our gear. With 2 guys and lightweight rafts, we were able to get everything under the weight limit without skimping too much. On the flight in, we crossed miles and miles of rocky mountain ridges. I've hunted in some pretty wild places in the lower 48, but the vastness of the Alaskan wilderness is on another level. Once the plane leaves us behind, there's this giddiness accompanied by a change in mindset. We're on our own now. We knew from experience not to bring any extra weight because the river was going to start small and we'd be doing a lot of dragging. The rafts only need a few inches of water to float in, but the river channels were so narrow in the upper parts of the river that the rafts were rubbing on both banks at times. We kept the rafts partially deflated so that they could squeeze between the banks and slide over rocks. The rafts are long and narrow so they can get through the skinny river channels but still have the capacity to haul us, our gear, and hopefully a couple caribou downstream. We need to get a ways downriver before we start hunting, so there's enough water to float a raft that's heavy with caribou meat. On our last trip, we dragged and then floated our boats almost 30 miles before we were confident that there was enough water to float a raft full of caribou meat. This trip we brought even smaller rafts, and we're hoping we'll be able to start hunting caribou even sooner. Dad's going to be paddling this smaller gray boat. It's a Pristine Ventures PR49. We didn't see any caribou on the first day, but we saw a nice bull moose across the river. After dragging Dad's boat down to some wider water, I headed back up for mine. My raft is also made by Pristine Ventures, and it's called the Legend. It's about 13 feet long and a little under 4 feet wide. My boat's a few inches wider than Dad's, and it was definitely more of a chore to get through some of these narrow chutes. We had to tilt the boat up on its side at times to drag it along. The extra load hauling capacity of the boat was nice once we got to bigger water though. Our first day was pretty much spent just dragging the boats down to where a few tributaries came together and made a floatable stream. On day 2 we were able to float most of the time and only had to jump out of the boats to drag them over shallow spots occasionally. After making it about 10 miles downstream, we were confident there was enough water in the river to float a raft with 1 caribou in it, so we set up camp and I hiked up a ridge before dark to have a look around. I spotted a few caribou above the tree line on the opposite side of the river, so the next morning we decided to head up there. It's late August and the caribou are migrating towards their winter range. They seem to spend most of their time high on the ridges where the trees give way to alpine tundra. The elevation of the upper part of the river is high enough where we only have to hike about 1,000 feet above the river to get out of the trees and into the tundra. On day 3, we hiked up above the tree line. We could see for miles and there were caribou dotting the ridge tops to our west. We spotted this small group of bulls about a mile away, and over the next hour or so they fed in our direction. When they came around the backside of this rocky knob, I decided to try to cut them off. There's a drop-off right in front of me that the caribou are working their way up. I'm crawling out on this flat area, trying to get to the edge of the drop-off before the caribou appear. I can't see the biggest bull right now, but I know he's in front of me and to the right. There's another set of antlers approaching on my left though, so I have to stop and set up right here. A different bull from the group is going to pass to my left, which will put him downwind of me here in a minute. With no cover available for me to sneak out of the way, I know this bull's about to see or smell me. He walks into about 20 yards and stops broadside, so I decide to try to pull my bow back. As soon as I move, the bull busts me and takes off. The bigger bull had also approached to within bow range, but I didn't notice him until it was too late. It was an exciting morning, and getting that close to two bulls in the open country gave me some confidence that I might be able to get one with my bow. After a lunch break, we were walking towards that same drop-off when I spotted a different set of antlers coming over the rise. We were both able to crouch down before the caribou got his eyes above the brush. We didn't have any tall brush to hide behind, so I was expecting this encounter to end a lot like the one earlier today, with the caribou busting us and running off. The caribou clearly saw something when he looked our direction, but because we were crouched down and motionless, he wasn't sure what to make of us. I had already knocked my arrow when I saw the caribou's antlers approaching, and I slowly reached for my rangefinder. I was hoping the caribou would stop and look the other way so I could range him and draw my bow. As the caribou kept walking to my right, I was worried he was going to walk out of range if I kept waiting, so I slowly pulled out my rangefinder and measured the distance at 37 yards. Seeing that little bit of movement made him nervous, and I was expecting him to bolt at any second. I decided it was time for me to draw my bow and hoped the caribou hesitated long enough for me to get a shot off. The caribou's at about 40 yards now, and I need him standing broadside to get a shot, but he turns towards me to get a better look. When he turned broadside again, I was hoping he would pause long enough to give me a shot, but instead he started to trot farther away. When he finally did stop, he turned to face me again, so I had no shot. He comes back towards me and stops at about 30 yards, but he's facing me, so I don't have a good angle for a shot. By now I've been holding the bow back at full draw for a while. I'm starting to get a little tired. At this point, I'm not expecting the caribou to stop and offer me a broadside shot, and if he does, I'm not sure I'll be able to hold the bow steady as I'm getting kind of tired. While I'm waiting for a shot opportunity, I keep reminding myself not to pull the trigger unless I know I'm going to hit him good. When he stops broadside here, I couldn't quite get the pin to settle where I wanted it, so I didn't shoot. When he stopped the second time, though, I was able to lock it in and get the shot off. The shot felt good, and I was pretty confident I had hit him where I wanted to.
Sweet.
I used the 40-yard pin on my bow when I aimed at the caribou, and I found the arrow which had passed through the caribou at 41 yards. The bright red blood on the arrow made it look like a lung shot, which is what I was aiming for. Because the country was so open, I decided to walk about 200 yards in the direction the caribou ran to see if I could spot him.
He might not have want to run across this shit. Maybe he took a right back there. We might have to do some more blood trailing though. There's enough brush over there to hide one that's laying on its side.
All the different shades of red in the ground cover made blood trailing really difficult. There were red leaves, red berries, and even red mosses. It took us over an hour to move the blood trail forward 120 yards. and I decided to take a break. I didn't think the caribou would have made it much more than 200 yards, so I decided to walk forward again and see if I could spot him. Looking to my left, I was surprised to spot the caribou laying in the jumble of rocks that I had earlier assumed he would have made a detour around.
Let's see, this was an exit hole on this side.
Yeah, a little far back, but did the job.
Doesn't look as high as it did as I was worried.
After I punched my tag, Dad and I backtracked the caribou's path across these rocks. We were both really impressed at the type of terrain the caribou could navigate. I was really pleased I was able to make a good shot and get the caribou with my bow. It was pretty cool that Dad was right behind me when it happened, too. Out of curiosity, I went back to the spot where I had stopped and made my initial look for the caribou. I had been looking out in the vegetation and looked right over top of the caribou that was laying in the rocks. Dad and I each packed some of the meat down to camp that evening, and then I went back the following day to get the rest of the meat and the antlers. We decided not to hunt for Dad's caribou until we got the rafts at least 10 more miles downstream. We weren't sure how much dragging we were going to have to do on the rafts, and we didn't want to heavily load the raft until the river got big enough to float it reliably. It turned out that the next day on the river was the worst in terms of dragging that we had the whole trip. It seemed like we were out of the boat more than we were in it, and at one point I swear I dragged the raft for a mile before I got back in and started paddling. The floor on my Legend raft held up great, but Dad had a little bit of gear resting directly on the floor of his PR-49. Pinching the floor between the gear and the rocks on the bottom of the river resulted in a few tears in the floor of his raft. If the water was deeper, a few holes in the floor wouldn't have been a big deal, as the raft floats just fine with a little bit of water in the bottom. But since we were getting out and dragging the raft over top of rock sieves constantly, it made sense to stop and patch the raft. Once the patches were in place, they held up the rest of the trip, and we didn't get any more holes in the floor. For long stretches the next day, we were walking the rafts down the river rather than riding in them. There was enough water to float the rafts, but there were so many boulders sticking up above the surface or just below the surface that you couldn't find chutes big enough to get your raft through without getting out and dragging it. Once we were able to get back in the rafts and start paddling again, the river had picked up enough water where it got a little spicy in places. Dad and I had floated this river together about 10 years ago, but between the two of us we had collectively forgotten how difficult it was, both in terms of dragging the rafts and some of the paddling maneuvers required. We were in and out of the boats so often, dragging them between narrow chutes, that we both got a little sloppy at times. I tried to ride the boat through a tight bend between two rocks where I should have got out and walked it. The current pushed the boat sideways against one of the rocks and swamped it, almost tipping me over.
Just a little water in the boat.
These boats are designed to float really high in the water so you can take them on shallow streams, so neither one is self-bailing. Because my boat had a tougher floor and a higher cargo capacity, we ended up running almost all the gear and meat in my boat. De-rigging and re-rigging the boat after dumping the water was a bit of a chore. Once we got about 10 more miles downstream, the river started to open up a bit, and we started to see caribou around again. The weather was reasonably warm and comfortable, which is good because Dad decided to go for a swim at one point. Once we passed our 10-mile goal, a major tributary entered the river, and we were confident there was enough water to float 2 caribou from that point on. We were both pretty eager to get back out hunting, but there was some weather rolling in, so we decided to set up camp and hunker down. Hunting in the rain isn't that much fun anyways, and after a couple hard days of dragging, paddling, and packing caribou meat, we were due for a break. One of the few luxury items we brought on the trip was a small cast iron skillet, which we put to good use cooking caribou backstrap. Thanks for watching part 1 of our caribou hunt. Be sure to come back and check out part 2. We still have another caribou tag to fill, and we've got 150 more miles of wild Alaskan river to explore.